Before we get started, if you're enjoying the Friday Reporter, I'd be grateful if you take a moment to follow, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us bring more conversations with the journalists, communicators, policymakers, and advocates shaping the national conversation. This episode is part of a special series exploring the future of journalism through conversations with the reporters, editors, and leaders helping build one of Washington's newest and most closely watched news organizations, Notice. When people talk about the future of journalism, they often focus on business models, technology, or politics. But journalism is ultimately about people, how we understand each other, how we make sense of our culture, and how we participate in civic life. My guest today is Alyssa Rosenberg, longtime Washington Post columnist and editor, cultural critic, and now dean of the Albritton Journalism Institute, the organization behind Notice. We're talking about culture, journalism, civic engagement, and what happens when people no longer feel connected to the institutions that shape their lives. I'm Lisa Camooso Miller, and this is the Friday Reporter. Alyssa, welcome to the Friday Reporter. I have got to get started here. You've spent the bulk of your career helping people understand culture, politics, society. What drew you in from writing and reporting to doing what you're doing today to help train the next generation of journalists?
So it was a couple of things. I had been a reporter and editor and columnist for about 20 years, and I took a buyout from the Washington Post in 2025. And I was kind of looking, I wanted to sort of experiment and see what was next and look for a good pirate ship to join. And I started getting to know some of the folks over at Notice. And when the opportunity came up to join the Albritton Journalism Institute, I thought, oh, this is incredible. There are so few pathways for young people to come to DC and to do so, especially if they aren't, if they don't have family money, if they can't afford to sort of take a risk. And the opportunity to both report at the highest level and to get sort of a classroom education seemed like something I wanted to be a part of, not just because I wanted to help our fellows at the Albritton Journalism Institute, but because I feel like I have so much to learn as a journalist, and in traditional newsrooms, there is so rarely time to stop and think and take on a new skill without completely stepping out of the flow of news, right? I mean, you can do a Neiman, you can do a Knight Wallace Fellowship, but there is almost never a structure that says, you could spend 3 days a week reporting, but 2 days a week really building new skills. And, I think that people who are coming into the industry today are bringing their own skills with them, but they're also entering a rapidly changing environment. And I don't entirely know how to navigate that environment either. And so the opportunity to say, look, we're going to help give you the skills we need while also getting those skills myself in the classroom. I mean, how could you turn that down? It's amazing.
Yeah, I think it's amazing too. And I'm glad that you're doing it. I also think that the world has changed so much since you and I first came on the scene in this world. What would you say are skills that young journalists today need that maybe weren't nearly as important when we started out?
So I came to DC 20 years ago last month, and I was the fact checker at National Journal. So I was sitting down with this print publication every week and figuring out how it was put together. And, if you were one of the stars of National Journal, maybe you need to know how to do a good cable TV hit, but you didn't need to know vertical video because it didn't exist. And you certainly didn't know how to shoot and edit and, sort of produce that video yourself. You didn't necessarily need to know how to do data journalism. Maybe you were someone who was inherently good at math, or you had some background that allowed you to sift through numbers sort of in a more sophisticated way than some of your peers. But you didn't need to know how to build your own visuals. And you certainly didn't know how to deal with artificial intelligence in a responsible way. And a creative way, right? I mean, the idea that you could have all this coding power at your fingertips, it wasn't even an option. And so, I think that the job has changed in ways that I think some people find stressful, but there are also incredible opportunities, right? I mean, the ability to be all in one, someone who reports, writes, builds your own visualizations and data viz, shoots videos so you can communicate with people in a different way, and can harness all of this coding power all at once. That's wild. I wish I'd had that when I was coming on the scene 20 years ago. And the kind of journalism that people are going to do is going to be so different, so much fun, so much richer. But we have to stop. And I think this is true from a resource constraint perspective, but also from just like thinking about what the job is. We cannot be in a position where reporters are petitioning for resources from sort of siloed teams in order to do this kind of incredibly rich journalism that is now possible, right? Like, if you want to have the most fun in this business, you have to have all those skills in one person, and you can without, being divided against yourself, without being exhausted, without being siloed in a newsroom. I think that's incredible.
Yeah, and it's certainly very hopeful at a time when people are feeling like journalism itself is headed in the wrong direction. I think that that's wrong-headed altogether, and that's why I'm so excited about talking with you and having visited with the fellows. All of that to me is exactly why I think that while we're in a moment of transition, it's actually for the better.
Totally. I mean, and look, do I wish that, there were hundreds of thousands of more journalism jobs in the US? Yes, because I think that, it is disappointing not just because local communities aren't getting served, national stories and international stories are getting undercovered, but because what each of those journalists could do if those jobs still existed is so magnified, that it's just sort of, it's infuriating to think that of the scale of what we could be doing. At the same time, you look at intriguing startups with new business models. I know Alex Seitzwald, who moved to Maine and is part of the team running the Midcoast Villager. Even in DC, the Washington Post decision to pull back from certain areas of coverage, I think is a huge mistake, but I love reading the CityCast newsletter every morning. Like, I get to work with Martin Ostermule, who I have always thought is like one of the great DC reporters, along with people like Michael Bryce Sadler, who are over here with us now too. And so, it is a tough moment, but it's also a moment of incredible creativity and innovation, in part enabled by some of these new tools and skills.
Mm. You yourself have spent time in the intersection between audiences and journalism. You've been reading over the course of time at the Post. You read thousands of messages from readers, including some super turbulent moments in journalism. I'm curious about what that helped you understand about how Americans feel about journalism today.
So millions of people who are still super invested in journalism, but they really crave a relationship and a compact between themselves and a publication. And I think part of what happened at the Post is that, there were millions of people who had signed on as subscribers during especially during the Trump administration, during the COVID-19 pandemic, who really believed the paper had the slogan that the paper had chosen, "Democracy dies in darkness." They took that to understand that the paper had adopted a certain political valence. And when Jeff Bezos decided that the Post wouldn't endorse a candidate for president in 2024, they felt like that compact had been broken. And so I think it's very important for publications to understand their own brands and to understand what readers understand those brands to be, right? Because, especially as we face down the possibility of Google Zero, as we've seen these sort of algorithmic apocalypses as places like X and Facebook have deprioritized news and linking, that direct relationship between publications and their readers is going to be more important than ever. And, I think that publications need to be doing a lot of research to make sure they understand and are on the same page as what their readers think that relationship is, right? Because, that if there is a misunderstanding there, you can kind of bump along for years, not have that be a problem. And then all of a sudden, if there is a misunderstanding that's exposed in a really dramatic way, I think that can be catastrophic for a publication. And it really has to be a two-way conversation, right? People are willing to invest. They want to get on board. They want to be in relationship with their favorite journalists. I think people view supporting their favorite publications as sort of a civic and political act. But you have to make sure that relationship is honest and balanced. I mean, I think you've seen startups like The Bulwark do incredibly well by building a really direct relationship with their audience and becoming a vector for charitable giving, for activism, for in-person socializing at their live events. And, you know, I think that publications that get that direct reader relationship right will be really well set up for the long term. And those who kind of coast along on their brand without building that relationship may find themselves in trouble, even if they don't have a moment of really intense rupture.
Mm, it's so interesting to me too because what you describe is what you and I both know is the way that we consume news, even as consumers of information. It's surprising to me how much I have, as someone who does this for a living, have found myself looking for better sources and better ways to understand what's happening because so much of the world has changed in the way that either the Post is covering information. I found myself going more and more directly to the source. There was something happened with a member of Congress not long ago. And rather than trying to find in my search and my research what was happening, I actually went to their direct page to see what they themselves were saying about what had happened. And whether or not that's the right way to do it, it seems to me like culture itself is influencing the way journalism is being reported and consumed. Do you think that there is, and by culture, I mean influence, influencers, all of these other things that are happening in culture that have become the way we get information. So, as much as we're still craving a relationship with our direct journalists, do you think that politics itself is having an influence on culture, or is it the other way around?
I might put it a little differently in two ways. First, obviously, influencers as professions, the sort of direct line between, um, you know, influencers and people's phones is new technologically, but it's not really new in politics or communication, right? I mean, you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's fireside chats are a deliberate attempt to circumvent the news media and go directly to the American public, and they were phenomenally successful. His opponents, people like Huey Long, who was publishing novels about, his imagined first year as president, or Charles Coughlin, who the radio priest who organized against him, you know. Radio enabled that mechanism as well in, sort of a very deliberate way. I do think what is somewhat different is that I think politics itself has become a form of popular culture, right? And so people are relating to politicians more like fans than they are like the employers of, their governor or their mayor, et cetera. They are enthusiasts. And I think you see this rise of a political type who is very deft at sort of creating content and consumable moments and those sort of fan interaction touch points. And, I think you see this with, people like the President of the United States. I think, Zoran Mamdani has been incredibly effective at creating that kind of content. And, you can have substance to back that up or not. But I think that, our politics have become sort of yet another fandom, yet another entertainment arena. And I don't think that's particularly healthy from a civic perspective, right? I mean, I think you want to maintain a posture where, politicians are people that we hire and fire, right? Like, we're taping this on election day in DC, and I'm very much thinking about, like, who do I want to hire as my next mayor after Muriel Bowser? But I do think that, sort of entertaining form of communication has become incredibly dominant in our politics. I forget which publication was reporting this recently, but like John Ossoff has used a very sophisticated clipping operation to kind of drive the idea of himself as a national politician. And, clipping and clip farming is a practice that kind of moved from the entertainment world to politics, right? Like, you have accounts that are, just driving engagement by posting short clips of movies, and now politicians can do that as well. And so it's going to change the kind of candidate that we get. It's going to change the method of political communication. But I also think it's incumbent for, rather than just decrying that, for reporters and news operations to be like, look, this is how people consume information. Would we like to get people to a place where they're reading long investigations? Yes, but like that's going to require meeting them where they are and leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that takes them from TikTok to the New York Times.
No doubt. You talked earlier about local journalism. Some people say that the reason that politics and national politics has become so much more of a pop culture or a hobby, perhaps, for people is because of the loss of local journalism and our own awareness of what's happening in our own communities. And it's forced us sort of like the aperture for national news to open up. I'm curious about why you specifically have, you've mentioned it quite a bit and talked about the loss of local journalism. I'm curious about your point of view and why people should care about that.
Um, I I'm not totally sure I agree that the loss of local journalism is driving the nationalization of politics. I mean, I do think that the rise of mass communications methods drives the nationalization of politics. And I also think that the political parties demanding a certain kinds of political conformity from local candidates drives the nationalization of politics. You know, folks like Matt Iglesias have written a lot about the need for Democrats to kind of tolerate a range of views, especially on sort of culture war issues, places where there's genuine disagreement in the electorate. But also at the same time, you have the Republican Party demanding enormous fealty to the president of the United States, to the idea that the 2020 election was stolen. And so, you know, some of this is driven by the parties themselves. But yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, as people get less good information about local politics, like, you know, they're going to have less sort of variation on the issues. But I don't think that like the local media alone is kind of driving that nationalization cycle.
Mm. Why does local media matter? I mean, you talk
Because
about reading the city cast. You talk about I stay pretty close
yeah,
to my local news. Like, why does that still matter?
Because so many of I mean, you know, we are like a federated political system, right? And so our issues are different. I mean, I always tell people who are considering moving to DC that it's an unusually great city in which to raise kids. And that's for a couple of different reasons, right? I mean, like, there are a lot of downsides to federal control of Washington. At the same time, like, our museums and our zoos are free. You know, New York is still struggling to get to universal pre-K 3 and 4. You know, DC has a system that has actually achieved that and has, you know, really prioritized paying teachers well, you know, and paying pre-K teachers as if they're, you know, something more than childcare workers, which of course they are. You know, mayoral control of the school system functions in a very specific way. And I'm a mom of young kids, so I think about the schools a lot.
Of course, yeah.
But, you know, we have, you know, they're just, like, it's an interesting city. Even with federal control, there's just a lot of, you know, there's a lot of specific policy that's getting made here, right? Like, I am really excited about the possibility of having Waymo in DC, and that is an issue that is going to be decided locally. And so, you know, I mean, one of the glories of America is that, like, we have this federal government, but we also have enormous local leeway to decide what our communities are going to look like, how we're going to live our lives. And so, like, to be an informed citizen on both levels, you know, the Washington Post is not going to cover, you know, I don't know, the debate over a budget override in Massachusetts to determine whether or not, you know, that town builds a $600 million high school. But, you know, that decision will, you know, whether or not to do that will be worth, you know, tens of thousands of dollars to every household in that town, depending on which way the vote goes, right? And if you don't have someone explaining that in clear and simple terms and giving people access to that information, you know, you're gonna make bad decisions. You're gonna miss out on, you know, sort of important things that will have a material impact on your pocketbook, on the schools your kids go to, everything else.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I'm glad you challenged that theory that I've been sort of testing out for some time about nationalism and local news, because I think you're right. The role of the party and the role of loyalty really is another piece of that. I hadn't really thought about that. I'm glad you highlighted that for me. I'm curious now.
Social media drives a lot of this stuff. Like,
Yeah,
you
it
know,
really does.
The algorithms rule everything around us. So
Yeah. Oh, well, no doubt about that. Um, Obviously, today we're talking, this is the third installment of the Notice Takeover for the Friday Reporter. Thank you so much for being part of it.
oh my gosh.
I'm curious, what do you think will separate news organizations that thrive from ones that struggle?
I think it's ones that have a clear understanding of what they're doing, right? And what I am excited about with Notice is this clear sense of the audience, right? I mean, DC is a place that has like high incomes. You've got a lot of people who are working in public service or in the business of government, but who also live here and, want their schools to be a certain way. They care about their sports teams. Trying to actually really serve an audience that with both sort of the rigor of and specificity of a trade publication, but that also recognizes that this is a company town. I think is such an important insight, right? And the Washington Post was and remains in some ways an amazing paper. I spent 12 really happy years there. But I think moving away from the idea that, this is an important city and it needs to be covered, right? I mean, in New York, the company business is finance. In Boston, it is universities and biotech. And here it's government, and that plays out in a lot of different ways. And the fact that you have all of these people working in this company business, but who are also bringing that same sort of rigor to their choices about sort of the neighborhoods that they live in, the school systems that their kids go to, and are, marrying their sort of spending power to social ideas about how the city should function, I think is great, and I feel like Notice knows what audience it wants to serve. And that brings us back to the idea of building a really solid relationship with that audience, right? Like if you really are thinking about who your audience is and thinking about not just what they want, but what they need, you'll end up successful. And I think trying to be sort of everything to everyone or bouncing between different audiences has been a recipe for failure for a lot of places. You need, there's so many pivots to videos, being in service to the algorithm, but on the other end of all of those technologies are people. And so as long as you're connected to the people, you're going to tell the stories that they need to hear, but you're also going to get back stories from that community that tell you where to go next.
Sure. I love that so much. All right, tough question. With our final prediction. I mean, no wrong answers here on the Friday Reporter. In 5 years from now, what about journalism is going to be different?
I think you're going to have, I think along with the rise of sort of personalities, you're going to have the rise of the nerds, right? Because you have all these people with nerdy instincts who are interested in numbers, who are interested in bureaucracy, who are now going to have the tool, who maybe, look, I was terrible at math in high school, right? Like I did not take calculus. I took statistics, which turned out to be one of the most useful classes I could have taken. And I always felt like I was not someone who was going to be smart enough to figure out how to code things or do math or understand computers. And they're going to be people with the instincts to organize information, who have sort of good questions they want to ask, who are just going to have their skills and capabilities totally unleashed by the new technology that's coming on board. I think that the ability to go out and find facts in the real world is going to end up being more valuable than ever. My friend Nick Bauman, who's the politics editor at the Washington Post, sort of has this theory that AI companies will end up subsidizing a lot of journalism because they need new information for training data. But I also just think that these tools will unleash a lot of kinds of questions, kinds of analysis, and kinds of journalism that will be really exciting.
I love that. Well, listen, I have 100 more questions, but time is short and the Friday Reporter is only 30 minutes. So I am encouraging all of my listeners to go ahead and keep following what's happening at Notice. And we will absolutely have another conversation again. Thank you for being a guest.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
My thanks to Alyssa Rosenberg for joining me. One of the themes that stood out from this conversation is that journalism isn't just about delivering information. At its best, it helps people understand each other, connect with their communities, and participate more fully in civic life. As the industry continues to evolve, that's a lesson worth remembering. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow The Friday Reporter, leave a review, and share this episode with a friend or colleague. It helps others discover the show and supports the work we're doing here. I'm Lisa Camooso Miller, and this is The Friday Reporter. Thanks for listening.